Hi guys, this is John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8. And I was just wanting to ask you about your current home internet provider. I'm just kidding. I am thinking about what I've been writing about while taking a delicious stroll in this Kansas City evening, somewhere along the parts of Penn Valley Park. I just had a beautiful dog run up to me and lick my hand. What could be better? I'm thinking about a popular trope, a popular type of person, a popular persona, especially in subcultures, that I myself, if anyone, should be guilty of falling in line with or living up to, and that is the Joker. The idea of the person who is sort of like the rebel, who has disconnected themselves from the mythologies and the mind-warping delusions of everyday people. And not only that, but they're able to play that game against them and sort of make other people think twice about how they're hurting other people in playing that game by playing it against them. And so I'm starting out this sort of conversation, which in many ways is sort of starting out my introduction to what I call InterObjectivity. I've mentioned intra-subjectivity in videos before, namely the ones that are sort of in that playlist. But this is like its sister project, which has to do with the inverse experience, which is that of the social world, that of coming to terms with what it means to live with others, to have an identity that in many ways seems to demand a particular kind of imaginary maneuver, which is believing in things that no one can actually point at or prove. And it's also fascinating the degree to which there's so much truth in this popular idea, because there's a sense in which it's invoking something that is quite obvious to a lot of us. And I'm referring to that movie, The Joker, but I've also never seen it. So I'm sort of the one with Joaquin Phoenix, if that's his name. I'm so detached from popular media that it's hard to keep track, but I am going to watch it, I promise you. But I've seen The Dark Knight, and so I'm familiar enough with what that identity means. And honestly, from the get-go, I find it to be a little bit sickening. I find it to be a little bit almost like unnerving, because there's something that is really like sophomoric or sort of almost missing in it. And that has to do with it's lacking like depth. It's lacking like any sense of like there being some kind of wisdom to it. Like there's a sense in which the current idea and ideal of the Joker is wrapped up in romanticism. And not only that, but it's wrapped up in this kind of like defense of what is ultimately a state of mind and being that is particular to any particular person, but demands other kinds of attention. There's a sense in which I'm not the one to say what it is, but I do what I do, which is thinking philosophically about things that we sort of take for granted. And so I think that the way that I like to work is to step back a few thousand years and sort of think about what this idea might actually mean in the affirmative sense. So the first thing I like to do is to affirm the idea. And what I'm affirming is the idea of this persona or person or identity or existence of what is sometimes like an incel type person, or is sometimes like a criminal type figure, or a sort of like wandering weirdo who has seen this movie, because I've heard people talk about it so much, or they're sort of familiar with this concept, and they say enough things to sort of let me know that they sort of think of what I sort of convey to them as believing in as being something that is just a joke, that it's ludicrous. And I'm a little bit more old-fashioned than other people in that I tend to be polite, and I tend to follow rules that are like laughed at by most people, and I don't mind being laughed at because I have a deeper sense of like what I'm doing when I play by the rules, so to speak. Whenever I am practicing a kind of kindness that seems to be a form of weakness, it seems to be a kind of like failure to be critical or to be myself. Because I think what I'm attuned to is what I think of as the interobjective experience that we have ultimately regarding not just other people in particular, but all social institutions. And that's a really deep term because it goes very deep into our experience as civilized people. And I think that there's something to be said for the kind of person who is naturally reacting to this sort of discovery that even human personality is a kind of scheme, that it's a kind of fake, and that most people are in fact only doing things because it's benefiting them. And so there's a sense in which the rich are winning and they're telling us to play by the rules, but they're not playing by the rules. So the real fools, the real jokers, from the joker's perspective, are those that are playing by the rules without realizing that the world is being run by people who are secretly violating moral and legal norms. And so there's a sense in which one is naturally wanting to take back power by reacting against that, by sort of asserting your ability to break the rules too. And not only that, but to sort of play this moral game where you're sort of showing it to other people that they're deluded, and not only that, but that they're hurting other people. And honestly, its connection to potential violence, not that that is what I'm talking about here in any way, because I don't think it's really even a philosophical conversation, but it really breaks my heart, like the degree to which so people are romantically enamored of this idea and then willing to act on it in a way that really just affects the lives of everyday people who really don't even understand the lives that they're living, and they're hurting other people too. So there's a sense in which one is not winning either way. But what I think is that the question is whether the person is really even driven by philosophical ideas. And I like to think positively, and I like to imagine that the people that are making jokes or rebelling or scheming or playing tricks or sort of like saying one thing to people in one way at one time and then saying it completely differently to other people at another time, who are sort of lying because they think that other people are lying, and they forget in many ways that they're lying. And so there's a sort of sense in which one begins to believe in these very, very delusions. So what I mean to say is that I have automatically an affirmative sense of what the Joker might mean. But what I'm troubled by is the degree to which it's often driven by a more underlying traumatic event that, like I mentioned at the beginning, has much more to do with very complex issues that demand that that person is able to really think on their own. And I think that this demands a certain detachment from being caught up in what exactly you are doing when you think that other people are lying to themselves and that they're just playing games, by living the lives that they live, by believing in what they believe in. There's a sense in which when you begin the very philosophical adventure that is questioning things that other people take for granted, you can end up in a position where you suddenly realize something that can be traumatic just to realize. And I think there's a certain finesse that's required with discovering this truth. There's a certain sense in which it's not about creating opposites and reacting against these. It's really a matter of learning how to dance. It's really a matter of learning how to play the game, so to speak, in a way that allows you ultimately to find your own path, to make your own choices about how you relate to it. Because I think it's really not even a big thing when it comes down to it, because on a certain level, what we're seeking is a particular freedom from the demands of a social life, a particular freedom from the overwhelming, insane tension that comes with living with the social world in your head 24/7. There's a sense in which I speak the way that I do about it because I'm sort of, on a certain level, I have a relationship to it that detaches me and gives me a certain freedom from it. But because I think when you can see it for what it is, in the sense in which when you can see what we're doing and living lives with other people and how complex, and maybe the sense in which you can see there's nothing that you can say about it, but that there are patterns perhaps that can be that can be described. And so what I'm thinking about is how, if you step back and you think about, like, first of all, like what civilization is and what it demands upon us. There's a book that's written by Freud called Civilization and Its Discontents. And he sort of introduces the idea that human happiness and flourishing is really incompatible with civilization. So there's a fundamental kind of compromise that comes with simply being in the situation that we're in that demands a certain symbolic sublimation. That's how Freud would perhaps think about it. But there's also a sense in which there's a fundamental unhappiness that's built into sort of learning how to live with the fact that to be civilized people, we compromise underlying undomesticated, wild inhibitions. And this is a very conservative way of thinking about what civilization is. And obviously, like, Freud is straddling different worlds, and there's a hyper-conservative thing in him that is bewildering. And so this is a theme that others have ran with, because it means in many ways like a question about civilization itself. And there's a question of whether or not civilization is even worth it, because civilization is really like a series of promises that we've sort of made for a very long time regarding the future. And people have this like innate tendency to believe that these promises will be rewarded. And one form of that is the covenant. And even the idea in believing in a promise and a covenant introduces linear time. You know, the thing that breaks us from believing that time is either cyclical or that there's no time at all is the belief that ultimately we're being tested in some way or another, or that time means something significant. And so there's a sense in which what we're doing when we're thinking about civilization is we're thinking about how it in many ways demands that we adhere to particular rules and dictums. And in China, you know, there's a Confucian kind of beginning that creates a particular kind of civilized response to the emergent complexity of civilization. And then there's of course other societies, and there's a sense in which with every society, even the more successful ones that are trying to create freedom for people, including Chinese societies in their own way, there's a sense in which there's very little room given for people who simply don't buy into it, for people who see through it, or for people who want to wander away, people who just don't want to be a part of it because they can feel in their bones that they have a different kind of destiny. You know, so there's a tragic sense in which civilization itself really doesn't really make room for people who want to reject it, for people who want to sort of live outside of it. And our society likes to think that it's the most free of all time. And yet at the same time, that very belief in its intoxication makes it nearly impossible for people to even step outside of our society. You know, there's a sense in which our managerial beliefs, and the sense in which we believe that even who we are as people are like the resources that companies and enterprises are using to make money in the way that they use products to make products. We see ourselves, unfortunately, in the same kind of way that leads us to living lives where we're so exhausted from beginning to end. We're so completely worn out. And this has in many ways to do with our inability to see that what we're trying to keep alive is very precious. And there are people who can keep it alive. But those are people who can recognize civilization and society for what it is, which I want to suggest is a particular kind of game. It is a particular kind of dance. You know, there's a lot of different images and analogies that are very helpful for thinking about like what we are doing when we open a door for another person, or when we use language, or when we use money, or when we believe in this thing they call society, which doesn't exist. Where is it at? It's fascinating how we live with this sort of idea of there being a society out there. But as a nominalist, as somebody that believes that only the specific really exists, I find that this is a unfortunate belief, given that there is no they out there. There are only particular people. And when you think that way, it can really free you on a specific level that's kind of subtle. But all of these maneuvers that you discover in learning how to free yourself from the mental colonization of society, so that you can live in society and have a healthy outward life, have a family, have a business, or whatever you do, like be whatever you are, even if you're rebelling, whatever it is that is like your yin, like even if it's like breaking free of society, there's a sense in which you can carry society into your wandering. So what I'm suggesting is manifold in that respect, because I think it's up to you yourself particularly to think about how you relate to it. And so what I'm sending are sort of letters from the other side. I don't know what my own future holds, but I've discovered an incredible peace and sanity in sort of recognizing that there's an inescapability to the otherness of the world. And it is a joke, and it's quite wonderful, in fact, quite dangerous to even think through it. But what's more crucial is to see it for what it is. And there's a certain precariousness and a preciousness that I think we have to honor on a fundamental level that requires a sort of radical humility. And that means that it's so easy, if you're a beneficiary, if you're sort of like we all are, living high on the fucking hog. I mean, we're all living in exuberance of surplus. Even if you're living the least amongst the least among thee. I'm not a moralist and I'm not preaching, but I think one has to begin with an initial appreciation for things that even allow us to, like for me to sit here in this gorgeous park like I am. You have to have a certain appreciation for social institutions, because they're like the imaginary games that for 100,000 years, like we've been perfecting. And so there's layer upon layer upon layer of imaginary games and promises that we have made with one another, that our ancestors have made. And I was mentioning earlier that we make promises about the future, and so the question is whether or not those promises are even worth living up to, about whether our future is even getting better than the past. That's a key, like, philosophical question. Like, are our lives even getting better? Like, was civilization even worth it? I have my own answer, and it would surprise you. I mean, I go in many different directions, but I think that one has to begin with, like I'm suggesting, a way of seeing how hard it is to keep this world going, how incredibly difficult it is when you're thinking about particular people. If you just look around and you converse with people long enough and you're around them long enough, you see how fucking hard life is, how painfully hard it is, and how it grinds you away. And you see that, to imagine that you can see through what they're doing, I think you have to hesitate, or perhaps live long enough to really ask that kind of question. And again, I'm not thinking about this in a moral way, but what I'm wondering about is philosophically is the limits of theory and the limits of radical skepticism that is driven by a philosophical recognition that so many things don't even have a basis to believe in, because so many things are, like I mentioned again and again, are a part of our shared imagination, because our ancestors and we are culpable in suspending our disbelief, to use a phrase of Coleridge, the British poet, regarding our willingness to suspend what we otherwise know to be false. And so what's fascinating to me is discovering all of these layers within ourselves and layers in the social world that are constructed. There's social constructions. And so there's a sense in which asking the kind of question that involves gender, as to whether it's a social construction, involves a larger question regarding the nature of social constructions. And that in itself can be terrifying and dangerous. And that's what I'm sort of trying to talk about, is how dangerous it is to people whenever you're from their point of view, arrogantly questioning them. Because you don't know what they know. And they don't even know what they know. And they're not going to tell you. And you might be hurting them. But perhaps this has nothing to do with that. I mean, I don't even know why I'm mentioning that. I think what I have in mind is that trope that I find to be so common in society. And like a lot of things, it's like a young man that you see, the Joker type young man. And I've been around mentally ill people a lot. And I've been around people who will steal your wallet. I've been around people who are shady. And they're also people who subscribe to this kind of position. Because what I'm sensitive to do is the degree to which people are not clearly thinking about how they could potentially be thinking about the Joker as someone that's connected to a wisdom tradition that goes back to the East and the West. And it's a tradition that in many ways has two different kinds of existence. You know, the way that the Joker has existed. And what I mean by it having two different kinds of existence is that civilization itself has created a kind of abundance, a kind of surplus that I'm talking about that we all live within. But it very rarely creates a space within which that can really be questioned. And there's a sense in which people need that questioning. They really value that. They find it to be delicious. They love, at least for a moment, sort of seeing through the very things that are crushing them, which is this belief in the metaphysics of society. And it, in many ways, destroys people. And yet there are two different kinds of ways out. You know, there's a sense in which if you're rich, that is, if you're one of the few who are in history able to live a life of affluence, and you were also somehow gifted mentally or taught in a certain way where you could see things as a joke, or if you just had like an innate sense of irony and humor, like those are the people that fascinate me most in history. Like they're the rascals. Like I love the rascals. Like there's a sense in which there's a wildness that comes out in some people. And so they're often threatened, you know, with being crushed. And it's scary and it's sad. And that's something that we have to take for granted, is that we even have an opportunity to exist in this otherness. You know, as someone who was kind of a weird kid and felt very alienated in high school, I felt unbelievably alive to go to art school. When I was 19, I went to an art school in like the big city, and I was suddenly around people who were like outcasts like I was. And it was a real renaissance for me. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. I was around all these other people, and we didn't have like a fraternity. There were no fucking sports. So I was free from all of that. And it was an amazing experience. And of course it ended at some point. But what I had was the sudden feeling of like a commonality of brokenness that is kind of really rare in our culture, in our world. And there's a certain level at which people who don't even have the opportunity to come together, or who don't have simply the ability to read books and disappear, because that's really what the affluent have done. They've created a leisure or a solitude or a room behind the shop where they've been able to disappear. Or they've created like what's called the monks, like the monasteries. I mean, that's where people could like disappear, and they were sort of honored in that disappearing. And there's another sense in which there are the shamans. You know, there are people who in larger societies, the shamans sort of disappear from the world and live outside of things in the wilderness. And they have a precarious role where society both shuns them and needs them. Like the shamans practice certain methods and methodologies that offer medicines, and they offer truths that are forgotten by people who live in the villages. And so the shaman is sort of a part of this too. But in my own kind of world, and where I'm sort of going with this, I'm gonna walk. I'm gonna walk a little while I discuss this. If you don't have money, right, and you're not like living like a shaman, you might become like a criminal, right? You might, like, in many ways, it's natural to like develop tendencies whenever you're intelligent. And what I mean is that if you're like kind of in a poor culture or society, where regardless of where you're at, and you're being told one thing, but you can sort of see that people are not really buying into that, people that are telling you to live accordingly, you might think that you don't want to be an idiot. And so you might think that you got to get what's yours, you know, while you can. Like, why would you be a fool and trudge along and live a life that's just going to get you nowhere. Because you could like self-liberate yourself. You could be like that book that checks itself out of the library. You know what I mean? And I'm not disparaging that. I think that there's a certain honor, a true honor and integrity to be found in like not being pushed around, and like kind of like seeing the human being in yourself, and seeing that you have to like say, I am human, you know, I deserve a life. And I have felt that way myself, and I had certain proclivities myself growing up the way I did. And so I feel that in my heart, and I can see that a lot of people who end up in jail, or a lot of people who end up on drugs, because that's a whole other side of this I won't go into. But when you start pursuing drugs, you're also pursuing this kind of like Joker-esque like way out. And it's like this way interior. And it's similar to what criminals are doing, in that it can be affirmed, you know, because it comes from a certain spark in us that can see that we are living one reality, and then there's another reality being impinged upon us, right? And that can be infuriating. That can be troubling. And not only that, there's a certain delight, there's a certain beauty to be found in like playing between the lines and sort of finding your own path and learning how to like play your own secret game and to use the rules to your advantage. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could be a con man. Like, what would be more fun than that? You could be just a liar. You could just lie to people. I remember discovering lying as a kid, like we all do. It's like sort of a phase that we all go through. Just like whenever we learn how to draw, or not when we learn how to draw, but all children draw. You could trace out in a child's development over the years, as they draw, the development of their mind. Like, you can see how a child's mind sort of turns on over time, in that they develop this like fascination with houses and objects at one point, and then lines and stories at another point. And girls and boys develop differently in the ways in which perceptually they're displaying their perceptual development, I mean to say, through these drawings. And so I think that there's something to really be seen in this, in ways that are regarding what it is that we are ultimately buying into what it is that we're ultimately adhering to. I think that there's a certain conceptual level at which we are developing notions and ideas that allow us to sort of make ourselves like who we are. And in many ways, there's what I was talking about, I just remembered, was learning how to lie. That there was a part of my own commitment to not editing these videos and not starting them over is that I'm going to have gaps in my thinking occasionally, especially after 28 minutes. So we learned there's phases of drawing that you could trace out in children's drawing, and it has to do with their seeing, how we see the world. But lying itself is something that is very, very fascinating, because we are told and we teach children that lying is a bad thing. And I believe it is. I think it's one of the worst things that you can do is to lie to other people. Because what you'll do is you'll start lying to yourself. Like, you'll start playing these self-destructive games that turn you against other people as much as it turns you against yourself. But that's neither here nor there, because lying itself is a profound human event. The discovery of lying is one of the more powerful tools a child develops. And so that's why you see children playing with this possibility, you know, in that they can say one thing that isn't true. And if people believe it, they have a particular kind of power. And so they're sort of discovering on one level, like the power of language and the ways in which it binds contracts or creates relationships of expectation. And so I'm sort of laying out a plethora of ways that an intelligence can lead to drug addiction. Intelligence can lead to criminality. Drug addiction can lead to intelligence can lead to perpetual compulsive lying, because the more intelligent you are, the more you'll be able to create intricate lies, and believing in that intricacy, that in itself is precisely what is so paralyzing. And this is compared to longer traditions where a person would be able, if they were rich, to simply get away on a certain level, or they're able to force power on other people easily, because we live in a hyper managerialized society where all of our relations and conversations are monitored on a certain level, and we're seeking out to expunge this underlying reality regarding the nature of society. And that's why even laughing about it on a certain level is potentially dangerous, or even raising questions. But I think not knowing how to handle those questions, that's the problem here. And by not knowing how to handle the questions, I mean is that because we don't teach critical thinking and philosophy in any way in schools, we never really become adept at handling the nuances of these kind of later discoveries. I mean, especially if it's a personal thing that you feel like you're the only one that is seeing that all of our lives are based on things that aren't necessarily lies, but in many ways they're really like theories that really have not proven themselves to the person that's seeing them. You're in a dangerous position, because on the other hand, the ability to sort of see philosophically that what we do when we have a consciousness, and what culture is as a whole, what cognition is as a whole, is an elaborate, highly complex kind of game. And I hate to mention philosophers, but I do compulsively. Ludwig Wittgenstein is a Austrian-British philosopher who, along with Martin Heidegger, is probably one of the two biggest philosophers of the 20th century, and most important. And he will radically affect the way that you think about the world and the way that you see the world. And similar to Heidegger, there are sort of like two different philosophies in Wittgenstein. So there's actually four philosophies if you're talking about Wittgenstein and Heidegger, but that's neither here nor there. The two in Wittgenstein are not important. The one that is important comes from his more later development, and that has to do with what he calls language games. Because see, Wittgenstein starts out as the kind of philosopher who's ultimately wanting to insist that what language can do is to convey propositions, and it can speak about things that can be verified as propositions. And so there's a clarifying, powerful, instrumental way of thinking that comes from Wittgenstein. And yet it's driven by a kind of certainty that he would later discover in his own thinking. And so he's one of the few philosophers to turn against himself on a certain level. He's one of those philosophers that, like Plato, represents the process of philosophy, because it's not about beliefs as much as it is engaging in a discussion about beliefs that put you on the line. And Wittgenstein, more than anyone, put himself on the line, because his later development was not really a turn against his early development as it's often portrayed. You know, what Wittgenstein really did was to pursue this very idea that most of us, if we're clear-minded, kind of take for granted regarding the nature of language. And most of us tend to think that language has to do with a certain coherence with reality. In other words, it's about a relationship between your mind mirroring reality, that your mind would have a correlation that's correct with what reality is. That's often like what we think of as being a natural way of thinking about the truth. But for Wittgenstein, what he discovered was that language is in fact always involving us in something that is so much more than that. And what he discovered was that we could not in fact verify the very thing that we assume to be true, because we can't see outside of this language. So there's a certain inescapability to it, which means that we lack transcendental metaphysics, which I take for granted as being the case, but it's sort of built into a lot of our thinking, and it was a major part of Western philosophy. And it's very difficult to shake us of, because it's also very dangerous, because it ultimately in many ways means seeing something that I agree with sometimes, but a lot of people really agree with probably too often. And it's the idea that our way of life, our very form of life, is itself a function of our environments and our cultures and our history. And so there's no universal culture. There's no worldwide sense of what counts as an institution or what counts as life in itself. Instead, there's a proliferation of games. There's no one way of thinking about what the relationship would be between the mind and the world. Instead, what we create are all these different ways of thinking about how we relate to reality. And I'm not exactly being as articulate as I should in honoring Wittgenstein, but what I need to suggest is that what he had ultimately discovered was something that is very much akin to larger traditions of, in many ways, seeing civilization for what it is, which is that on the one hand, you can see it in a negative way as being a trap, that it's an imaginary thing where people are pulling the wool over one another's eyes, But I think that there's a tragic sense in which when you see that what we're ultimately living out is perhaps inescapable, in that if it were possible to be otherwise, it would be. But there's a sense in which it is the case because it is the case. And when you've come to that point of really accepting it for what it is, I think that's when the joy really begins. Because why is it that some people on a certain level seem to be sort of free from it? Where does that levity and joy come from in some people, where in spite of the burdens that we live with and the expectations and the seriousness that we live with, that there's certain people that can almost live on two levels at once, where they can live out that life of civilized demands, but at the same time, they can see it for what it is and play it for what it's worth. I think that there's something very positive to be said for the discovery, in fact, and this is really what I mean to get to, that the world and these institutions, these games, there's no outside of it and there's no end to it, because they're significant in themselves. Like the musical life is in the repetitions of these daily cycles involving conversations, involving the routines of going to where we're going and returning. In other words, there's a sense in which one can be, if you learn how to not think on a certain level, and I'm a compulsive thinker, but I don't really think all the time, because a part of enjoying your life in lieu of having to do all these things, like wash the dishes, like going to bed at the same time, like going through all these routines, like getting your taxes done. I think that there's a certain beauty when you're not thinking, and I don't mean just not thinking at all. It's not like you're planning out your time, but there's a sense in which there's something that might not seem to be connected to this, and that is one of my deepest passions, and that is the baroque. The world of Vivaldi, and not only that, but the world of figures like Michelangelo, the later Michelangelo, who sort of originates the Mannerist and later art movements that in many ways celebrate what we as Puritans, a lot of us are the descendants of Puritans, we find to be obnoxious and ostentatious, but the Baroque celebrated this exuberance, this ornamentation. One of my favorite things are the cathedrals in France. The cathedrals in France are constructed during this period of Baroque exuberance. And you can see the surplus economics in the way in which it's taking from the poor and how it's actually like this political thing. But I think it's missing an underlying point. And it was dismissed by later people, later movements. And it was in many ways almost foreign to the earlier Renaissance. But it is connected to it, because in the Renaissance and what comes fully to form in people who make up the Baroque, which are Antonio Vivaldi, Handel, the British German composer, and Michelangelo, but also Giambattista Vico, the Italian writer who is one of the first sociologists, right? So Vico is one of the first people to understand systems, to think about human beings as being a part of systems. We take that for granted, but it would be a long time before later sociologists like Weber and others were able to understand what sociology even means. But sociology itself is kind of a Baroque discipline in that it contains a kind of unending ornamentation and elaboration, yet it lacks the music. It lacks the fullness of the cathedrals in France. Because what I'm trying to suggest is connected to the very possibility that the meaning and the purpose is already here if you learn how to hear it. Like the meaning and purpose of life isn't in life itself so much as it is found in our minds, our attitudes, our state of being. And of course, we're born who we are. Like we're all thrown into a circumstance. Like we're all helpless on a certain level. But there's a certain power that even the Stoics, like Epictetus, one of my favorites, didn't really articulate, because he's in many ways from a time and place that's so different from where we're from. But I think he was getting into something that is absolutely vital in discovering that what I'm speaking about in regards to the Baroque, or in regards to of the significance of the music and the cathedrals, is the underlying sense in which they were wanting to celebrate what is the unfurling, unwieldy, but intricate, labyrinthian, circular, dancing like, twinkling, glittering, ephemeral, bouncing on and off, sort of giggling like nature of our world. There's a sense in which like babies laugh because their first initial experience is this sort of fundamental on and offness. And I think that there's almost like a sense in which when one is attenuated to that, which can be seasonal, it can have to do with the rhythms of life and the patterns of night and day, of sleeping and waking, and the nature of life and death in a fundamental, expansive sense. There's a sense in which you might discover before it's too late that in using language and in living with other people, like that is the meaning of life in itself. Like the meaning of life is not out there. It's not going to happen later on in your life. Like the meaning of life isn't something that can be explained to you. It's something that you have to attenuate yourself to. And it's not a romantic or extravagant kind of thing. I'm not portraying it as a transcendental kind of experience, because it's really a down-to-earth kind of seeing that even paying your taxes is connected to the very act of like dancing a certain way. And I could be accused of being like forgetting the pain and trouble of everyday life. But I have to look beyond that, because I think that on the one hand, this intelligence that we have, this ability that we have to see it as a game and a fraud, can be liberating, but it can be quite dangerous to you as a person. It is dangerous to others, and that's why the Joker is sort of represented as being like this sort of like subterranean figure who's like rebelling against these traps. And we almost like sympathize with that. But there's a deeper level at which we're wrestling with the nature of civilization itself and all social institutions. But your very identity itself is a function of this social institution. You know, there's almost an unsayable creaturely quality about all of us that is the real self. And this disappears because we disappear into our imagination. And in many ways, as I was saying, we have to honor the reality of everyday life and how hard it is to even keep all this going. And we have to sort of begin with that appreciation and affirmation of it. But there's a sense in which we also have to learn how to make sense of these questions that we have about what it means to have a family. You know, what does it mean to go to school? What does it mean to have a future? What does it mean to settle down? You know, what does it mean to laugh? What does it mean to have a few drinks and sort of like relax and allow this cosmic perception to seep through? And by cosmic, I mean the occasional, or if you need, constant realization that you are in fact free and that there's nothing wrong, and there's nothing wrong that you have done, and there are no problems. So I think that I always speak about people specifically, and that's why I think these videos are irrelevant, because you can only speak to particular people. And what I mean is that everything depends on where you're at. Because if you're being completely destroyed by the grinding sense of expectations about your future, about what you're supposed to be doing, or if you're overwhelmed by your past and how it shaped you and made you feel like there's no way out, then it's extremely helpful to begin taking seriously the realization that, yeah, there is something uncanny, something fraudulent, potentially, something like a social construction that is in fact perhaps working against you. And perhaps you ought to figure out your own way of playing your own game. Does that mean stealing? I don't think so. To a lot of people it does. I think it's a tragic situation to be in. But does it mean sublimating that into just making jokes and thinking that everything is silly? I think that's almost even worse than robbing. I mean, there's a sense in which our irreverent, cynical, absurd fucking attitudes that don't take anything seriously, that's the most pathetic response of all. Because that in many ways fails to take seriously the reality of a world that is calling to us. And so that calling to us in many ways involves a questioning of this imaginative space that has made us like who we are and what we are. And so that's perhaps a little bit ambiguous, because what I'm perhaps painting is this multifaceted conception that a person can have when they don't give away to the worst impulses. I think drug addiction in all of its forms is a wonderful thing on a certain level, because it allows a person a radical reorientation, or it's a kind of tool for grounding yourself in a perspective. But it makes no sense if there's no discipline involved. Like, it makes no sense if that drug use isn't coupled with a masterly control over yourself. And by masterly control, I mean you have to have a critical sense of what you think that you're resisting, that social world. Like, you have to have a critical sense of what it is that you're coming from, that you see yourself as resisting. And I know these thoughts don't even make sense perhaps in themselves, because I really see them as being a certain kind of initiation point. And so that initiation is going to lead into an exploration of things that involve a conception of what other people even are. I know that sounds weird, but I mentioned earlier, like, society doesn't exist. There are only other people. But even when you're thinking about another person in particular, what do you know about them? You don't know anything. Like, I'm actually willing to suggest that you don't even know anything about yourself, or you don't know what you think you know. You might understand a lot of things on a subliminal, fundamentally crucial level, but you don't know yourself like you think you do. And you don't know other people, even an individual level, like your friends and those in your family, like you think you do. because there's a fundamental horizon, a fundamental limitation in that you don't have access to their minds. In philosophy, this is called the problem of consciousness. Sometimes it's called the hard problem because it's an impenetrable problem, impenetrable. And what it means is that you can never have a first-person experience of another person besides yourself. We're always thinking and speaking in third person. And so even scientific experiments and progress is in a way that is unable to access this impenetrable quality that comes with being you, the subjectivity of your experience. And that's something that I'll talk about later, like in my podcast, The Waking Mess, that I'm creating about fundamental philosophical questions like consciousness and the mind-body problem and problems about the meaning of life and God. But I think that what I'm trying to suggest is that what this means is that whenever you are assuming that you sort of know about these other people, that what you're projecting is precisely this game, this kind of like institution that you see yourself as maybe freeing yourself from, but you are in fact playing that kind of game without realizing it. And that's a trap if it's leading to a false kind of understanding. That's the one thing. But the second thing is control. When you're trying to control other people on the basis of that false understanding, that's what I think is so destructive. And on the other hand, we play that kind of game with ourselves, where we presume a kind of understanding or knowing about ourselves that we don't have. And then we try to like impose that twofold control over ourselves that we don't really have. And so it's no wonder that we feel completely jammed up, completely destroyed, because we're ultimately not allowing ourselves to see that we simply don't have access to the kind of information that we want to have about other people. And our court systems and our social relations on a certain level almost demand a kind of certainty regarding the minds of other people, in the sense of understanding their motivation, their intentions. And on a certain level, we have to participate in that kind of institution and that kind of game. But we also have to operate with a masterly sense of these questions beforehand, so that we can see that we have to make careful contingent claims about other people in lieu of recognizing the very impossibility of even accessing that. And so I think on a certain level, you see that the social institutions and language games that we play are actually allowing us to create this very world that we live in. There's a certain level in which, to bring up Wittgenstein again, I mentioned his language games earlier, because that's sort of like a key thing in my development of InterObjectivity. But he has another theory called, it's sometimes called the private language argument. And what it is Wittgenstein's argument against the idea that you can have a personal language, or that you can invent like a system of rules or signs that mean that you communicate with yourself and yourself alone. Because what he's saying is that to think at all, to have a private life that exists in language, is to exist socially, because language is social. And so there's a certain inescapability of the social in thinking at all. And that seems absurd, but it means that we can't so easily have this dichotomy about us and the other. Because to live in language is to live with others. And that's to see what it involves. And it's no wonder that a lot of people don't point out the correlation between language and money, because money also involves us in a relationship with others. And these are questions that are also politically related to libertarianism. Not that I'm saying anything political about it, but there's a sense in which the question that some people have for libertarians is, to what degree are they not creating a fantasy of this isolated self, an isolated self that is free from all social institutions, because to what degree are we not automatically involved in one another simply by being here? Is not the individual selves in many ways a kind of construction that has gone overboard, that has led us into thinking that we can be these cowboy-esque sort of astronauts disappearing into our own free-floating internet fantasy space, So there's there's a sense in which these elements are a part of social institutions. And when I was young, just like everybody else, I had incredible anxiety. Like, I grew up like unable to speak at all. I mean, I never spoke. I was an observer, but I was always around people who would sort of tell me that, or imply to me that I had no right to speak, and so I later, through attention from others, sort of learned how to speak and sort of like how to have a voice. And that wasn't until I was in my late 20s. Between my late 20s and my early childhood, it was deeply paralyzing. It's so easy to forget what we go through when we're in high school. But I was so alienated that I was all sort of lucky that bad things didn't happen because of what it could have possibly triggered in me. So I was blessed with being in where I was and around the people that I was in school, because I was able to somehow make it through without completely unloading. And what I mean is that, like, this proliferation of acts in our society that can hurt other people and people can harm themselves, you know what I'm saying? That's driven by this like jolting, traumatic response to the games and social institutions that we've constructed. Like, high school is like a traumatic thing because we're sort of forcing kids, wild creatures, we're forcing them into these straitjackets. And we have to, I guess. I mean, given that it's just the overwhelming momentum and weight of civilization doing what it does. But we all cry out, and I cried out myself. And luckily I was close to a few people that, allowed me to hold on a more fundamental level, at which I was able to discover a particular kind of love that created like a little pocket of freedom within myself. And that would later grow in conjunction with my own development of having a voice. And having that voice developed for me philosophically in relation to seeing what language was and what it meant to have expectations put on yourself, or to try to connect with other people. I think that was the underlying feeling that I had, was wanting to connect with people and feeling like this vast gulf between us. That's what was so painful. And as I became politicized and hyper politicized in my 20s, in many ways I was able to see myself not as the Joker type. I was never even really familiar with that then, but I was able to identify with other figures. And so one thing I wanted to sort of mention earlier is that one of those is Alan Moore's V for Vendetta, which I think is a far better, V for Vendetta is a far better book or movie than The Joker, given its own more profound connections to the anarchist tradition. And I suppose that could be like another video that I make. I'd like to make a video about the anarcho-feminists that are so close to my own heart, like Voltairine, de Cleyre, and others. And there's so many different ways that you can take it, but I think the most beautiful way to take it as listening to the birds, like I sort of am right now, Like, speaking of the baroque, you can hear it in biology itself. You can hear it in the conversations, right? And so if you're ever overwhelmed with the institutions of life and you're like wanting to maybe hurt yourself or hurt others, because that's what I was meaning to describe in telling about myself, is that I did later become free from all this. And that's in many ways what I'm trying to sort of enunciate and explain here, is that potential opening, that sort of potential freedom that can come. And I've been writing in this essay that's called Turning Tables, that's about my experience as a server. Because as a server, I sort of developed my own theory of significance and what counts as meaning. And I found myself as a server and going through all the reputations and maneuvers of taking orders, wiping down tables, getting coffee, stirring coffees, that I could disappear into these acts in the way that one can disappear into a baroque performance like Vivaldi, where significance is performing inside of itself. And I think that that's where one gets the upper hand on what social institutions are demanding of us. I mean, because if you can try to find your way out and sort of like live in the wilderness, or like I've mentioned before, you can take all these other paths. You can become a comedian. That's probably something I haven't really mentioned as much, which is that you can make jokes like in a more profound way than just being a jokester, like Richard Pryor and others. Like, you can see how they were in many ways working to free themselves through these jokes. Like, it's quite clear. But I was mentioning the birds earlier, and when I see these trees and the way that they grow, I think of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings of anatomy, which include his intricate drawings of human arteries and capillaries and veins. And in his drawings, Leonardo discovered the geometrical law showing that the ways that veins and arteries grow is the same geometry by which all things in biology grow. And so there's a symmetrical geometry in the expansion of nature. And when you look at how beautiful it is in these trees that are like silhouettes, against that nice twilight blue sky, there's significance in that, right? That's significance. Now, it's not big significance, it's not fine art, but when it's combined with this beautiful smell of someone having a barbecue somewhere far away, it's quite intoxicating. Because the experience in itself is significant in itself. That in itself is crucial here, because the ability to see through and to sort of have a point of view. One begins with the questioning of social life, and one can go in a lot of different ways, but one can also come back around to seeing that there's no difference between the birds who are singing in their own baroque ways and what human beings are doing. Because what I'm trying to sort of come home with is this idea that these human practices like cooking and being together are in many ways just as much natural expressions of our own imaginative world as birds are expressions of themselves in making bird songs. And so there's something that they are unconscious of, obviously. And so there's something that we are maybe too conscious of. And perhaps that ultra consciousness about what in fact is really natural, like ants in ant hills, or hi there, or any other creature that's in their world. Every ecology, every world means participating in this baroque, like, intricate performance of design and unfolding complexity. And so human language and all of the things that demands that are put on us, that all in itself is really just a part of the musical life. But again, this is not a romantic or like touchy-feely kind of claim. I'm not trying to say things that make us feel better, but to point out the reality of something that is not moral but ontological, in the sense that we can take it many different ways, you know. And that's why I always go back to mentioning particular people, everyday people, because that's sort of like the place where the very thing has significance, you know. And so what we have to shift is our state of mind regarding the interobjective, so that we don't see it as something that's determining us, but it's something that we determine. You know, we can author our relationships, we can author our rhythms and routines, like we can shape our curling significance, you know, and find that when we're living in our bodies and not living in our minds, that this significance lives through us. So I'm speaking as someone that wants to keep alive the very questions that, like, the Joker is asking, but wants to temper it with like a deeper sensitivity to what it might mean to see the truth, being that the truth itself is that language and human social life, which is something that goes inside of us, as I mentioned with Wittgenstein's private language argument, all of that all that is something that we can sort of really learn how to make our own, you know. And we can really learn how to grasp the realization that the very things that we think of as being real within us are just as unreal as the things out there, you know. And that's what I'm exploring in my InterObjectivity video. It's sort of a parallel to this interobjective, because the only thing that can rescue me is a perceptual sensitivity, which is not self-conscious, like a sensitivity to life, a way of being in the world that isn't really a thinking, as we think of it, cognitive relation to reality, but is a physical, bodily relation to reality, because that allows you to see to sense the potential aesthetic beauty, the potential like splendor that could be found in the repetitions of everyday life. It sort of allows you to see all of that really for what it is, and to sort of have a relationship to it that is able to know when it's not working for you. I think that's what I mean to say, is to have the underlying ability to see when these institutions and games and elaborate dances and rituals that we play, whenever you're able to see that it's going to get you to a place where you can have some security and have some comfort and have some sanity, but you have to be aware of it for what it is if it's not going to destroy you, because we want to have a healthy relationship to precisely that very thing that has gotten us to where we are, you know. And to honor it doesn't mean to let it take us down with it, to let it take us down, you know, by making a home in us. Like, we have to be able to free ourselves from the weight of these games, by seeing them in a way that allows us to not see them at all, because we're suddenly like returned to reality. And reality is particular. It's in the body, it's in the senses. And so long as that's existing, the interobjective isn't real. Except that, interestingly, what they call symbiosis, or in semiotics, means that even to think at all is to be social, is to have language. But that's why in other videos I'm going to differentiate between what I think of as real thinking and abstract thinking. Because I think real thinking is in the eyes, real thinking is in the senses. And I think when we can see the difference between self-aware thinking, which we often tout as being the crown jewel of Western civilization, that is being aware of being aware, when we can see that as being secondary to the truly sublime quality of being alive, which is having naive consciousness, having a simple consciousness, when we can see that as being the most valuable virtue, when we can see like seeing it all, or just having lungs, having air, having breath, just being able to go to sleep, when we see that as valuable, you know, that's really when we've returned home. So I'm John Edward Willie. This has been a beautiful evening, and I love you all.